Hello, my name is Avyi Konstantinides, and I am the co-founder and the director at the Los Angeles School of Homeopathy. We wanted to share this information with you. It was a class that was taught this year in April by one of our teachers, Daly, who is fabulous and wonderful. And our disclaimer is that we are not medical doctors, nor are we making any medical diagnosis. As always, these are just suggestions and we are not making any claims. We are just sharing some information with you that was taught in one of our second-year classes. As always, please see your healthcare provider for guidance. And then, of course, if you have questions, call your homeopath. As with any illness, it's best to have individualized treatment when using homeopathy. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to give the school a call. Our number is 310-279-5016. And I want to wish you all a happy and safe flu and hopefully COVID-free season this year.
All right, we can now start. Welcome everybody. And so we're going to start this morning session by talking about the epidemic, pandemic. So that's our first topic for the day. So I'm going to review, first of all, epidemics and pandemics. So I'm going to first of all go over the philosophy of this topic, because there has never been a time in the history of homeopathy when this has not been more relevant to understand exactly what Hahnemann was talking about, because Hahnemann nailed it with what he wrote about the treatment of epidemics and pandemics. And it is so pertinent to our work today and going forward, because obviously we don't know where this is going to go at all, and what we're going to be called upon to treat as homeopaths. I know myself, I have been treating a number of COVID-19 cases remotely so far, not that many, but a few. And I've been following a lot of the online discussion that other homeopaths around the world have been having about their experiences treating the epidemic. And it's really quite an extraordinary time for homeopathy, because there's such a communication between all homeopaths who are involved, such an exploration of what's working, what's not working, how to help. And also another discussion is going on concurrently. Somebody's making a lot of noise. I don't know who it is. A lot of discussion concurrently about how we can most promote homeopathy as a viable method of therapeutic treatment for this pandemic, because, you know, it's kind of excruciating for us to watch the world freaking out and not having treatments available other than drugs that really don't work too well. And for us to know that homeopathy has such a potential. So how can we most make ourselves useful in this pandemic by helping people and by getting the word out that, you know, homeopathy has such promise in these situations. And for me personally, I felt like, you know, in England, Prince Charles got a positive test for COVID. And, you know, the royal family have been using homeopathy for a long time. I don't know if he took homeopathy when he was, you know, in quarantine, but no word was ever mentioned about it. So I know for sure he's had chronic homeopathic treatment, but nothing was said. So that's very frustrating. But you know, this is the situation that we're working in. So I'm going to go over what Hahnemann said, and then we're going to talk a bit about the virus itself and and what's been established about treating it so far. So first of all, this slide differentiates epidemics and pandemics. So an epidemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. So this is how we refer to things like measles. You know, there are from time to time measles epidemics and other infectious diseases. So Ebola, for example, which was confined to a limited area in Africa, has not gone beyond a epidemic status. Hhowever, when, and you know, if you've been following the whole COVID-19 story, you will know that, at a certain point, the World Health Organization decided that COVID-19 had become a pandemic, which means that it has spread across a large region, for instance, multiple continents or worldwide. Which means that the susceptibility of the human race is much more vulnerable to this epidemic, and therefore it's allowed it to spread. So, you know, in the media, we see, oh, well, the pandemic, it spread by the fact that we have what's called globalization, that there's people traveling around the world. Well, that's true. But there is another factor that's also true, which is that there has to be a very large susceptibility in order for it to become a pandemic like this. So that's one of the things that homeopaths are trying to understand, is what is this greater susceptibility that has allowed this pandemic to establish itself on the human race. That is it's a very big topic. It's not something that can be more than theorized at this point in time, but it's very interesting to think about. So Hahnemann writes about the treating of epidemics in a number of paragraphs in the Organon. So the first one, I'm just going to read it quickly, and I'm assuming that any of you who have a question will just ask. I'm just going to keep going unless I hear a question. So this is paragraph 73, where Hahnemann talks about acute diseases. So he says, an acute febrile disease that befalls a person individually is occasioned by malignancies to which this person has been particularly exposed. And then he goes on to say, sporadic acute diseases attack several people at the same time, here and there, sporadically, occasioned by meteoric or telluric influences and malignancies. They only affect a few people. So a good example of what this might be is people who are susceptible to cell phone radiation, which comes under the category of telluric influences. You know, there are not that many people, as far as we know, who are susceptible, but there are definitely some people are. So this would be a sporadic acute disease. And then he said, bordering sporadic diseases are those acute diseases that seize many persons with very similar complaints from a similar cause. These diseases tend to become contagious when they spread over thickly congregated masses of people, then feed.
Joe, we lost your audio.
To a contagion here, and I wonder why that was. This says, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? It says my...
Yes, I can hear you now, but before I had a gap.
I got a pop-up which said that my internet was unstable. So if you lose me again, I think there was just some variation in the internet briefly. So just let me know, like you did then, if it goes off again.
Okay.
Okay. So Hahnemann's introduced the idea of contagion here, specifically when there's thickly congregated masses of people. And that, holds up for what's been happening in this epidemic, that when there's a lot of people together, the disease passes easily, and that's why everybody has been separated out from each other artificially. And then he says, then fevers arise. Each epidemic disease has a fever with its own nature. Since every case of disease in a given epidemic has the same origin, the diseases puts all those who have fallen ill into the same kind of disease process. When left to itself, this disease process ends either in death or in recovery in a moderate period of time. Epidemic diseases are not infrequently engendered by the calamities of war, floods, and famine. So this I'm going to come back to a bit later on, because it's very interesting what he says here. Not infrequently engendered by the calamities of war, floods, and famine. So when you look back, I've been studying somewhat the history of epidemics over the last few centuries, and there's always something going on in the world that seems to precede an epidemic or a bad epidemic. And the most obvious one is the 1918 Spanish flu, which was the worst epidemic, much worse so far than this one, which started right at the end of the First World War. So it's interesting to look at what's been going on in the world in the last couple of years and see how that relates to this statement. So this all holds up what Hahnemann said here. When left to itself, this particular disease process, which has its own nature. So really, this is what we're trying to understand. What is the nature of this specific epidemic that ends either in death or recovery? So then we go to the Organon paragraph 100, where Hahnemann actually starts to talk about how to investigate an epidemic. He says, it makes no difference if something similar ever appeared before under the same or any name. The novelty or peculiarity of such a contagion makes no difference, either in its examination or its cure, since the physician presupposes that the pure image of each presently reigning disease is new and unknown. He must explore it for himself from the ground up. So I think it's quite amazing that Hahnemann said this, you know, because he was speaking before knowledge of, you know, germs and everything we know now about what viruses and bacteria cause. He knew nothing of that. But what he did observe is that each epidemic had its own unique character. It was not like any other epidemic, even though it might be called the same thing. So what we've got here is something that is being called a flu, but it's not similar to any other flu that's been before. So he made this recognition that as homeopaths, we have to look at it as an entirely new thing. We can't treat it like we might have treated another flu before or something that looks similar. We have to put all those ideas out of our heads and just explore it from the ground up. So I love this rubric here, this aphorism here, where he says explore it from the ground up. That's what everyone's doing. So then he goes on to say in paragraph 101, it may well be that the physician does not get a perception of the complete image of the epidemic disease with the first case he encounters, since each such collective disease only brings the complex of its symptoms to the light of day with the closer observation of several cases. Meanwhile, the carefully investigating physician can often come so close to the true state, even with the first or second patient, that he becomes alive to the characteristic image of the disease, and then finds a fitting homeopathically commensurate remedy for it. So there are two things that he's speaking about here. He's saying that sometimes you don't get a full sense of the whole epidemic with the first case, or even the subsequent cases. You might not have a picture of the whole epidemic, but you can often, he says, come so close to the true state, even with the first or second patient, that, and this is, the physician becomes alive to the characteristic image of the disease. So this is really our job in treating epidemics, is to become so familiar with this particular disease process that we become alive to its characteristic image. And why is this important? It means, first of all, that we can recognize it. So as homeopaths, you know, we're not going on whether somebody tests positive or not. That's not our criteria. Our criteria is that we become alive to the characteristic image of the disease. And it's not even that we can list the symptoms. It's that we are, if you like, our being becomes sympathetic to what this disease is expressing. We recognize it on a deep level. And why is this important? It's because once we start to see the picture of the disease as it presents in its most general way, then we can become more aware of when in one individual there's something that is not true to that characteristic image. So we'll see again a broad picture, a general picture of the disease and its characteristics, but then as well we'll see that individuals sometimes will have their own discrepancies from that general image. So what we get in the end is a kind of microcosm of what we do as homeopaths anyway, which is to understand the bigger picture and then the characteristic symptoms that are only true for that person. So I'll talk about that as when we get on to talking about the remedies more that have been appropriate for this epidemic so far. So then he goes on to say, upon recording the symptoms of several cases of this kind, the sketch of the disease image becomes more and more complete, not larger and more verbose, but more characteristic, more encompassing of the peculiarity of this collective disease. So it's important, he says here, that the sketch of the disease image becomes more complete, not larger and more verbose. So he's saying it's not that we have, you know, more and more and more information, but we have a more accurate image. So it's accuracy here that's important when we're collecting information about the epidemic, not, you know, huge lists of symptoms. He says, on the one hand, the general signs, for example, loss of appetite, sleeplessness, obtain their own narrower determinations. On the other hand, the more marked, peculiar and rarer symptoms belonging to only a few diseases emerge and form what is characteristic for this epidemic. So he's describing exactly what I was talking to you about in taking the case yesterday, that we have the generals and which become more specific in an epidemic. So exactly what that loss of appetite might be like, exactly how that sleeplessness tends to manifest, for example. And on the other hand, we get the strange, rare and peculiar symptoms that we don't often see. So you put these two things together, the specific general symptoms and the strange, rare and peculiar symptoms. And those two together form the characteristic picture of the epidemic. So continuing on, he says, all those afflicted by the epidemic at that time have the same disease, flowing from one and the same source. However, the entire extent of such an epidemic disease and the totality of its symptoms cannot be perceived in a single patient, but can only be completely abstracted and gathered from the sufferings of several patients of different bodily constitutions. So here's another point which he makes, which is why we have to see a lot of people in order to get the picture of the disease more clearly, is because everybody's different in their physical constitution. And so in each of those people, it's going to manifest a little bit differently. And so we have to take all that into consideration. And it's rather like I was saying yesterday, when you do a proving, if you only do a proving with 2 people, you only have 2 different constitutions to compare. It's not the same as doing proving with 50 people, where you have male, female, young, old, you know, thin, obese, all the different varieties of types of constitutions, which gives you a much more accurate picture. So in different epidemics, you're going to need more or less number of people in order to perceive the disease picture accurately. And one of the things that's become clear in this epidemic, which is something, you know, homeopaths are also talking about, is that the picture of the disease seems to vary somewhat in the different locations that it's manifesting. So, you know, it started in China, moved to Iran and some Eastern countries, and then it moved to Europe and to the United States and on. So each time it's moved, it's manifested in a slightly different way. So homeopaths in Iran, for example, were finding somewhat of a different totality than homeopaths in India or homeopaths in the United States. So it's not vastly different, but it's somewhat different. So that also is, it's like, it's not only different bodily constitutions, but it's different nationalities, probably, it would be the best way to say it. Different parts of the world affect differently. So what we're looking for has been termed the genus epidemicus. What that means, that term means the specific remedy for the epidemic. Now, there's not one genus epidemicus, there's always more than one because of these variations that we find. But this means that a group of people in this disease process act as if they are one person. And so I was talking about this yesterday, it's the same when you do a proving and you make an artificial disease, it's also as if one person. So this approach takes the symptoms of a group of people affected by the same disease or artificial disease and creates a picture of the common symptoms of the disease as a whole. The remedies that cover this picture are the group of remedies to be used and differentiated by their individual characteristics. So this is a really interesting study to make of different epidemics. Paul Herskew, who's a homeopath on the east coast of the United States, has been studying epidemics for a couple of decades, and he has written about each epidemic, the SARS, the MERS, Ebola, and the characteristic symptoms that have emerged for each of those. Even though, you know, some of them, for example, not many cases of Ebola have ever been treated by homeopathy, to be sure of what remedies might work, but the symptom picture looks pretty clear. So it was actually Asiatic cholera that made homeopathy so prominent in the 19th century. Hahnemann used camphor as a preventative for cholera and found that it worked quite effectively. He also used cuprum sulph for the second stage of cholera, and he published his results in a number of papers which meant that other homeopaths started treating cholera and publishing their results. And so in the US, in the 19th century, there were 7 major outbreaks of cholera. And the death rate in those outbreaks was between 1/3 and 1/2 of the cases. So much, much worse than the epidemic that we're experiencing now. But when homeopaths started treating these epidemics and publishing their results, it was found that only 35 deaths out of 1,116 cases were reported. So this is a huge, huge result when you compare it to what was happening before homeopathy was being used. And so I think it's this that makes homeopaths so desperate almost to be able to treat enough cases of any epidemic to show the possibility of homeopathy. So after a while, Hahnemann concluded that the remedies camphor, veratrum and cuprum were the genus epidemicus for the Asiatic cholera that was that kept arising. And so these 3 remedies, one of those would be used for each patient because they all had the common symptoms of the cholera, but they each had subtle differences which would vary from patient to patient. So for example, if you studied cuprum, I don't know if you have yet, but cuprum is a remedy. It's one of the remedies in the Materia Medica that creates the most severe spasms. So one of the symptoms that would be very bad in the Asiatic cholera were spasms of the intestines, and eventually the whole body would be in a spasm, with blueness as the cholera progressed. So spasms and blueness were the keynotes for cuprum prescription, whereas veratrum didn't have the spasms, but veratrum has terrible, terrible purging, simultaneous vomiting and diarrhea with extreme weakness and sweating and blueness. So these were the symptoms that would make veratrum the choice over cuprum. And camphora is also a remedy that has extreme sweating, very extreme sweating, cold sweating. And camphor is a remedy of absolute collapse. So in a very rapid time, the patient goes from being pretty okay to being in a totally collapsed near-death state. So this is the most rapid onset of symptoms in camphora. So obviously there's a lot more to say about treating cholera and those remedies. This is basically where the homeopaths came to with their choices of remedies. So, moving on to the coronavirus now, we're going to look at the symptoms that have been identified as the common symptoms, and then what are the most strange, rare and peculiar symptoms that seem to be emerging of this disease. So COVID-19, it is the novel coronavirus, a totally new disease, which is what Hahnemann said we should approach it as. So here are some of the symptoms that have been identified, and these are the general symptoms that are manifesting in nearly all cases. So the first symptom is that the onset of the disease is gradual. This right away rules out the use of some remedies. For example, our remedy belladonna is known for a sudden onset of flu-like symptoms. So belladonna has not really presented itself strongly in the treatment of COVID-19, whereas remedies that have a gradual onset of flu-like symptoms are highly indicated. So most people say that they start to feel unwell, but they don't really get a fever for a couple of days. Second general symptom that's emerged is that the fevers generally are low to moderate fevers. They're not really, really high fevers in most cases, and that the patient has extreme chills. So chills with a low to moderate fever is the second general symptom. The next symptom, which is more specific, is an extreme state of dryness. And nearly all patients so far with COVID-19 have expressed a feeling of dryness, not so it expresses as respiratory dryness, but also I've heard people say that the head feels dry, which is strange. They can't quite describe it except that they feel very dry, but there isn't necessarily a large thirst, or if there is a thirst, it doesn't seem to mitigate the dryness. So that's a more characteristic symptom as well. Then there's a generalized flu-like aching, and very specifically a lot of headaches. So headaches have become quite prominent. Some people have much worse headaches than others, and some people get headaches further on into the disease. And when there is a headache, that seems to also change what remedies are indicated from the cases when there isn't a headache. Next common symptom is a dry cough with scant expectoration. And I think this is perhaps the symptom that most characterizes this epidemic, that nearly all people at least people who have tested positive and so surely have it, have a dry cough. And it starts sometimes with a sore throat, sometimes it goes straight from a dry cough. But one of the things is that it doesn't start with cold-like symptoms. It usually doesn't start with a runny nose or sneezing, although it could do, but usually it starts right away with a dry cough. And with that cough, there's barely any expectoration to begin with. The mucus develops later on. Now, what was noticed after a while is that a lot of the cases, the eyes look strange. And this is more of a strange, rare, peculiar symptom. And hospitals have started recognizing patients now because of their eyes, that there's a form of conjunctivitis, which is more an inflammation. So there's not a lot of discharge, but there's certainly an inflammation of the eyes, the conjunctiva, in one or both eyes that accompanies the early stages with the dry cough. Sorry, I'm just going to turn my phone off here, getting a lot of calls. Okay. So the next strange, rare, and peculiar symptom is loss of smell and taste, or in rare cases, an increase of the senses. So again, this is a symptom which is not common to flu normally. It's not something that you would expect to see along with the other symptoms, but it has emerged as a pretty common symptom of many of the cases. And it's true the cases that I've treated so far have had that symptom. And they're actually using it, interestingly enough, at least around where I am. If somebody presents with a fever and loss of smell and taste, they pretty much say to them, you have COVID. They're taking it as a confirmatory of the flu, even without a test. And then there's, in many cases, there's diarrhea with the cough. So it's not necessarily at the same time as the cough, but the patient, as well as having a cough, has diarrhea. So we're calling it a concomitant symptom. If you remember, a concomitant means that there are two apparently disconnected things that occur at the same time. So diarrhea with cough is very specific to certain remedies. Then, sometimes this is the extent of the symptoms that a patient will have, and they'll go on, after a period of time to recover with or without homeopathy or other help. But if they're in some way compromised or vulnerable and they don't recover from this stage, then the disease moves into the more alarming stage, when it goes down into the chest and creates a pneumonia situation, which is what the panic has been all about. So the cough goes down into the lungs and there's a sense of oppression of the chest. Now, I've treated a number of cases so far with this symptom, and people say, almost without fail, I feel as though someone is sitting on my chest. And the feeling of that oppression is in the upper part of the chest. It's just below the larynx, where people feel this oppression initially. Some people describe it as like a rock or a stone in the top part of my chest, or just a feeling of somebody sitting there. I've been treating one patient who said, it feels like my toddler is sitting on my chest. And if this continues, now some people will have this oppression of the chest, they'll have difficulty breathing, they'll have dyspnea, but they can still recover at this point without assistance. Although obviously, if you know, I've mostly treated people at this stage because this is when people start to freak out. They don't want to go to hospital. They don't want to be put on a ventilator, but they also don't want to die, basically. So then the worst stages of this is when it develops into pneumonia, which means that the oxygen saturation goes right down, and the lungs gradually fill up with fluid. And as the case progresses, there's more and more difficulty breathing, and people who die from respiratory failure and lung collapse. And I have some descriptions, although I haven't myself not treated any of these cases. I have some descriptions from homeopaths who have been treating cases which are this extreme. And really, you know, these cases are treated by homeopathic doctors in hospitals. They're not being treated by homeopaths at home.
Joe, can you tell us what the last line of that slide says? It was covered by the...
Yeah, the last line says collapse with gasping for air and respiratory failure. So that's really the final stage of this disease when it ends in death. So now here are some of the most peculiar symptoms that have been identified. And these have been gathered from a lot of people who describe these things in different ways. This is what's really been put together as a synthesis of the most unusual aspect of this disease. So the first one is that there's a sensation of fullness, and people describe it in all sorts of different ways, but it's like there's something in the head, in the chest, that makes it feel full up. Chest feels full. The mucus, head pain feels like a fullness, bursting, exploding. All of these phrases are coming out. And emotionally, interestingly, person feels overwhelmed, too much going on, can't deal with the amount of what they're having to deal with. A deeper expression than just one symptom. And I see my internet connection is unstable again, so you might lose me. Hopefully.
We did lose you. We lost you once you said that emotionally everything is too much to bear.
Right, okay. So this symptom is very interesting because it goes deeper than being just affecting one part. It's a deeper expression of the disease because it affects both the mind and body. So emotional fullness and overwhelm, or fullness in the head, fullness in the chest. And with that fullness comes a need to forcibly expel mucus. So the coughing is very forcible on the exhale. And this is unusual also. So it's very difficult to take a deep breath. They can't breathe in, can't expand the lungs fully, but then they have to forcibly cough. So it's a very strong cough to try and get the mucus out, because the mucus at this late stage of the disease is described like honey. It's sticky, thick, gooey, like honey. So which remedy do you know has thick, sticky mucus?
Calibi?
Calibichromicum, that's right, yes. So when you hear a phrase like that being expressed more than once, that remedy obviously is going to come to mind as a possibility. But the strange, rare and peculiar aspect of this sticky mucus, so if you imagine yourself having a lot of sticky mucus in your lungs, you want to sit up and cough it out. But what's happening with these cases of COVID is that people feel better when they're lying down, as if, and one person described it like a jar of honey, where the honey only comes out when the jar is laid on its side. Now that is extremely unusual. Most people don't feel better coughing and getting mucus out when they're lying down. But this has been a symptom that has recurred in many cases at this point. So these are all the most strange, rare and peculiar aspects of the disease, which are not really focused on by the allopathic doctors, because it doesn't mean anything to them. But for homeopaths, that helps us look in our remedies, in our materia medica, for remedies that have these symptoms. Now, not all patients have this, obviously. These are the worst cases, but it's the worst cases in a way that, you know, we would really like. No, actually, that's not true. I think that in all stages of this disease, we can find a remedy that will help. It will help keep people out of hospital, and if they are in hospital, it will help stop them from dying. But these are all the symptoms that, you know, we might be able to use if we are in a situation of treating somebody who's really, really bad. So
Well, lying down, it was only better when lying on the side, right? Because my friend, when she was lying on her back, thought that she's going to suffocate.
okay, that's very interesting. So she had pneumonia at this point?
No, everything what you said so far matched. And she said that an elephant sat on her chest. It also felt better at night. She felt better in bed, but she could not lie on her back. The second she was lying on her back, it all contracted again. So she had to sleep in an odd position on her side.
That's really interesting. That's a very good piece of information, which I don't know. You know, I mean, I have not got all the data for all the cases, so I don't know if it's been more commonly expressed that lying on the side is better. But that's really interesting. Thanks for adding that in. So I'm just looking in my COVID notes here to see if I've got anything. I've got better lying down and not moving. So that's one of the things that people have said. Better lying down, phlegm comes out easier. Phlegm often described like gunk. Can't take a deep breath, can't take anything more in because the lungs are so full. So it's almost like, the feeling is almost like the lungs are completely full up. There's no room to breathe in any more air. So let's look at some remedies here. So these are the most common remedies that have been used so far. So aconite is the remedy we use before we know what's going on. If somebody says they don't feel well, you know, they feel that they might be getting something. Aconite can be used successfully to ward off fevers or ward off disease developing at that point into anything else. So aconite is a good remedy for people to have on hand in case they start to get symptoms. but it's not going to deal with anything more than that. It's not, if they've got developed symptoms, it's not going to help. But the good thing about aconite in terms of this epidemic is that it's a big remedy for fear of death. And fear of death is one of the overarching symptoms that's accompanying this epidemic, right? So that's why the world has gone into a total freak out, because there seems to be a complete panic about death. So aconite has that symptom and therefore is a very good remedy to give in the very first instance. And I've done that, you know, with quite a lot of my anxious patients who, you know, really need to know that they're not going to die, basically. So in my practice, I'm really currently I'm getting very few calls from my chronic patients who don't really want to discuss their chronic state right now. But the ones who are anxious, I'm getting a lot of anxiety calls, and I'm getting people who have some kind of acute symptoms who may or may not have COVID, but definitely want to be treated acutely. So my whole practice has changed in a very short time. And I imagine it's going to go on like that for a while. So aconite I prescribe quite a lot. So then arsenicum album is also a very good remedy for some cases at the beginning. It has the chills, it has the fears, and it's, you know, obviously it's one of our major flu remedies. It has prostration and weakness and anxiety and restlessness. So all of those can appear at the beginning when symptoms aren't very clear. But a big remedy in this epidemic so far, and you know, I don't know how much, or if you have used remedies for treating people or what you've been doing at all, but Bryonia alba covers a lot of the initial stage symptoms of this epidemic. It covers the dryness in a very big way. It covers the dry cough. Bryonia classically has a very slow onset of symptoms and produces a low to medium grade fever with accompanying dryness. So that really matches the, you know, the early symptoms of the disease. It also goes on to develop pneumonia symptoms. So Bryonia is one of our main symptoms for early stage pneumonia, also with difficulty breathing deeply, worse from any motion. But Bryonia does not, sorry, my phone is still tried to quieten it down. A lot of people trying to get hold of me today. Okay. Bryonia does not produce a lot of mucus. So when the condition moves into a lot of mucus production, if they're still not doing well, then Bryonia is not going to be an appropriate remedy anymore. Next remedy that's been, I mean, it's been the remedy that's sold out in all the health food stores, gelsemium. Gelsemium, again, is one of our big flu remedies. And the symptoms that gelsemium matches are very slow onset, gradual headache, aching, chills, feeling tired, feeling weak, wanting to lie down and go to sleep. So that gradual flu onset of symptoms, especially, you know, when there's a headache as well and body aches, is a very good remedy for the beginning of this epidemic. But again, it doesn't develop into the lung symptom picture that is the later stage of these remedies, of this epidemic. Next two remedies on here are phosphorus and phosphoric acid, which have similarities, obviously. And these two are some of the most prescribed remedies so far, successfully in a lot of cases. And phosphorus is one of our big pneumonia remedies. It has the ability to, you know, go deeply into the lungs and produce this kind of state of fullness of the lungs. It has the cough symptoms, the chills, it has the thirst, and interestingly, it has a craving for cold drinks, cold fruity things. And this craving for fruits or cold fruits, apples, has been quite strong in quite a few cases. So phosphorus and phosphoric acid will both have those kind of cravings. Phosphoric acid particularly craves sparkling drinks, carbonated drinks, and that's come up in some cases also as a strong craving. So the main difference between phosphorus and phosphoric acid is that phosphoric acid is very weak. All the acids have weakness, and phosphoric acid is extremely weak and collapsed. They have no energy, they have no emotional energy, no physical energy, they just want to stay in bed. You know, the classic phosphoric acid will stay in bed, they don't want to talk, they just lie there facing the wall and wait for everything to go away. Phosphoric acid also has diarrhea with respiratory symptoms as a concomitant. So again, that's something that we talked about has occurred in some cases. Mercury, I think, Sonia, you mentioned giving mercury to somebody for this disease. I have not seen a lot of mercury, only one, I think. Mercury has profuse sweating. It has a lot of sensitivity to temperature change. So the temperature is not stable in mercury, and it has a lot of salivation. So those are the main symptoms that might predominate in mercury. It also has sore throats. So if you've got a stronger symptom of sore throat, you might go more for mercury. Calibichromicum, we've mentioned already with the sticky mucus. And calibichromicum is a great remedy for that thick, sticky, gelatinous mucus that is so hard to get up, but comes up in great gobs. And so the word sticky, stickiness, comes up in the cases that have done well with calibichromicum, especially if there's also fullness in the sinuses, because it's one of our main sinusitis remedies. Now that's not the most common presentation of this disease, but it has occurred in some cases. And the other remedy that seems to be almost identified as a genius for the epidemic in its severe stage is antimonium tartaricum. And this is a remedy for advanced pneumonia, when there's weakness in the chest, great difficulty breathing, loss of oxygen, and there is a tremendous amount of mucus. Person feels like they're drowning in mucus very often. And so I don't think you've done this remedy yet, but you can study this remedy and see. It's often prescribed for, acute respiratory conditions that have got bad, and definitely seems to be very successful in turning the corner for people with this epidemic so far. I think Jeremy Sher had quite a number of reports of pretty advanced COVID cases turning around with antimonium tartaricum. So then I'm just going to go over some of the unusual remedies that have been identified so far. Now, these are probably not remedies that you know, but I put them on here. You can go and read about them if you're interested to. Arsenicum iodatum is an arsenicum salt that has come up quite strongly for this feeling of fullness in the lungs, where it's difficult to expel the mucus. Eupatorium perfoliatum is a remedy that is prescribed in serious flus where the bones are so painful, the aching is so painful, person feels like they are you know, the pain is almost unbearable in the whole body. This remedy has been prescribed in tropical fevers where there's dreadful aching. And so that's the main symptom for eupatorium, when the pain in the body, the head and all the joints, the muscles are aching so much that the person is really struggling with that particular symptom. Now, Sticta is a plant remedy. It's actually called Sticta pulmonaria. So it's a lung remedy. It has a particular cough. Lobelia inflata is a remedy for difficult respiration when there's gasping for air. Senega is another remedy that arises in advanced states of pneumonia. So I'm not going to go into detail about all these remedies because I haven't got time, but you can look them up for yourselves. Squilla maritima is a remedy that has the concomitant symptom of cough with diarrhea, which is an unusual concomitant, cough with diarrhea. I once treated a child who had the measles badly. And, you know, you get a cough with measles, so the child was coughing, and every time the child coughed, a little squirt of diarrhea came out. And I gave Squilla, and it was a fantastic remedy for getting over the measles. Spigelia is also a remedy that has recently emerged, which has stabbing and knife-like pains, and quite a few of the cases have complained of knife-like pains. Croton tiglium is a remedy that has great difficulty expanding the lungs. And then we have camphor, which has been used mainly in Iran and India for treating this epidemic. It hasn't been found to be quite so successful in the United States. But in India, it's been given as a prophylaxis. First of all, they were using arsenicum as a prophylaxis, and then camphor. But it hasn't seemed to be indicated here with the extreme state of collapse that camphor produces. And finally, stannum. Stannum is another remedy that has, it's usually prescribed for conditions like COPD when the lungs are really compromised and there's a lot of mucus, but it's impossible to raise it up, or again, they're drowning in mucus with great weakness. So again, that's the remedy that has been found helpful. So you can see from this that there's not 1, 2, or even 3 remedies that so far have been identified as a genus, but there's a group of remedies which is very helpful if you're trying to study a case to see what ballpark you're going to be looking in and what will differentiate giving one of these remedies over and above one of the other ones. So my final slide on this topic is just to give you something to think about. The big picture, this is the bird's eye view of COVID. What is the fundamental derangement of our collective vital force? So, as if one person, we have been collectively deranged by this particular situation. What are the common symptoms? As homeopaths, we know that an acute illness is an opportunity to heal the deeper chronic state, and that with the help of the simillimum, we may jump over the obstacle of the acute and be healthier for it if it doesn't kill us. So the question for all of us to think about is, what is the collective vital force trying to tell us? I think a clue came from what Hahnemann said, that epidemics often arise in times of war, famine, or other kind of intense situations. So think about what's the world going through? What's happening on our planet right now that might have caused the human vital force to have to do something quite as drastic as has been happening? And what are the common symptoms, not of the disease per se, but the common symptoms that have affected everybody. And what I'll put out there to think about is a phrase that I hear all the time. Every day I hear this phrase is, we're just in our own little bubble. We're just in our own little bubble. And that's what's happened to people. Everybody has been separated out into their own little bubble. And in that bubble, we are staying healthy. But if we go outside that bubble, we're going to get sick. That's the sense that everybody has, that we have to stay in a bubble. And there's another remedy, which I didn't put on that list, which has that type of sense of themselves on a deep level, and that remedy is ozone, which is a new remedy proved by a German homeopath, Anna Schadder, and it has a great picture because ozone is related to the health of the planet. The ozone layer thinning was one of the first crisis symptoms of our planet's degradation and crisis. And ozone does seem to be a remedy that might fit the collective vital force of all of us as we, hide in our own little bubbles away from each other. So those are just my thoughts.
Interestingly, they just found another hole in the ozone over the Arctic.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, ozone's a very interesting remedy, which, hopefully you'll get studied later on. It's on the carbon row, but it has this symptom of the feeling of being in a bubble. And, if you listen to the language of the vital force. That's what I was telling you to do yesterday. Learn the language of the vital force. And how many times people say, I'm just in my own bubble. It's happening all the time. So that's the kind of thing that homeopaths pay attention to, right? So that's the end of this epidemic presentation here. So I don't know if any of you have anything you want to ask or contribute or add, any of you treated cases. I won't put the video on. We'll just do it as voices, but if you want to say anything, I think it's a good opportunity now.
I saw a lot of videos on the whole subject matter. I like Jeremy Scher's take the most, considering the whole, what it is forcing us to do. It is forcing us to slow down, to see that we need to breathe, that we are poisoning our environment. Now we can't breathe. I thought that made a lot of sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Jeremy's one of the greatest people for looking at the big picture. He himself does the bird's eye view picture as well, very well.
Yeah, I liked his stuff a lot. And I have come across, my friends just came back from New York, Broadway actor, and they flew back home here when Broadway closed, and they were severely sick. He tested positive, his wife didn't. And that's when I learned that the tests are done very, very poorly, and you get a lot of false negatives because they don't swap the right way.
Yes.
And Avi helped me with the case. I asked her if she would, because obviously I can't take the case. And we gave bryonia. And there was an elephant sitting on her chest, and around 7 p.m. panic came over her that she actually cried because she couldn't breathe properly anymore. And around 9:10, everything eased up. So the panic eased up, the breathing became better. And when she was in this state of not being able to breathe, the harder she tried, the less it worked, and the dry cough came up. So the cough that doesn't produce any mucus. And they had the low fever. Hers was lower than his. They had fatigue is missing. Both of them had crazy, crazy fatigue.
Yes.
They couldn't move. They couldn't attend to anything. They have 2 kids. Both of the kids are okay, by the way. None of them are showing any symptoms, nor did they get it.
That's great. It does seem that very few children are being affected. Not all children, but it's many more older people, which again is a phenomenon that we, later on we'll maybe be able to understand this better, but it's definitely true.
Yeah. And chills, crazy, crazy chills. The blanket doesn't warm you up. And then they didn't get tested because the Germans were weird about it, but I'm convinced that my parents got it because their neighbor had a bad cold. The cold ended up in pneumonia. He ended up in the hospital. But this was already beginning of February. So even the neighbor wasn't tested for COVID. And then my parents came down with the exact symptom picture. They still think I am crazy, suggesting it was COVID. But they couldn't breathe, they had the chills, they couldn't move. And yeah, it matched down to a T. And they survived it, that's the good news. But they also live in an extremely clean air village setting. Even though my mother smoked for the last 50 years, she is still alive to tell the story.
Right, but that might be one of the reasons why she got it also. Because compromise in the lungs does seem to predispose people to get it.
Yes. And my father handled the illness better than she.
Right.
So he was also severely sick, but she was down much more severe and the cough was more severe.
Yes, yes.
But again, a 50-year smoker at age 75, alive to tell the story, not in hospital, was impressive to me.
It's very impressive, yes. And so did they take remedies?
They actually, a week and a half into it, they let me know how severely sick they are. And before everything happened, I sent them to the pharmacy when watching China still to get supplements. And I told them to get arsenicum. And only thing that they had in the house and desperate times had them take it because they think I'm practicing witchcraft. And that's all they did, all they had. And my mother said she took it a few times when she felt the cough was really hurting her. So definitely not geared to what they were experiencing, but what they had on hand.
Yeah, very good. What you have on hand is the best remedy for you right now. So yeah, so this has definitely been a problem, I think, for some people getting the remedies if they haven't had them on hand. So it's the Hahnemann pharmacy shut down for a while because they were so backed up with orders, and I think everything's settled down more now in terms of getting remedies.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. It was very interesting. Anybody else have any stories they wanted to share?
I just have a question about with people who have recovered with homeopathic treatment. Has there been any relapse, reoccurrence of symptoms, or is there any way to know if then that person now has built immunities to the infection?
There's no way to know about immunity without a test, which I imagine they'll start doing that later on. I mean, I'll just share with you that my concern about the long-term effect of this is that they will develop a vaccine in time for this particular epidemic, and that they will, in short shrift, make it compulsory for every citizen to have it, because that's the only way they're going to enforce it. And it will change the laws regarding vaccines very quickly, because they'll have a foot in the door for compulsory vaccine, and it will become a federal offense to not vaccinate. So that's in a way, I'm more worried about that than anything else, because once you go in that direction, it's very hard to get back from that. So in answer to your question about homeopathic treatment, I think it's too early to say, but it depends on, you see, if somebody gets a remedy that really nails it in their particular condition, so let's say that they have a case of COVID, they're given phosphorus, which partially matches their symptoms, and they get better. Phosphorus seems to help, but it's not a miracle, but they get better. But maybe we could say that that was close, but not close as it could have been. Then they might relapse. Sometimes we'll see a relapse and then they'll need some more remedy. But in the cases, and this is why it's important really to pay attention to these strange, rare and peculiar symptoms. Suppose the remedy they actually needed was an unusual remedy. But suppose they actually needed spigelia. Now, if they had been given spigelia, then it would have cleared up quicker and they wouldn't relapse. And that's how we know the difference, really, of when the remedy we've given has been partially accurate or an amazing miracle. And that's the case with homeopathy in general. But it's definitely true in these kind of situations that if a person relapses, it probably means that they needed a different remedy, at least in the end stage. And I have a case in that situation with somebody who's had COVID, she's had pneumonia. I've given what appeared to be the best indicated remedies, and she's relapsed, not badly, but somewhat, a couple of times. And I've tried to see if there's another remedy, because I actually think there must be another remedy that's needed that would, knock it out of the park. And that's what we're always trying to do, is to try and find that exact match. And sometimes, we get a strange, rare and peculiar symptom that stands out, and we can do it, and it's wonderful. And sometimes we struggle to find something that helps us to see a better picture.
So what Nadine stated about her parents, they had arsenic come on hand, so that's what they took. That's probably a best
Yes.
case. I mean, if whatever you have that will at least meet some of the symptoms, then better to take than not anything at all.
Exactly right. Yes.
They both relapsed.
Right. So that really holds out what I'm saying. Yeah.
It's like even when you read the accounts of Sankaran or whoever is posting cases online, a lot of people are doing better and then they crash.
Right.
It seems to be one of the COVID MOs.
Yes, I think that's true. But I think the cases that have had, there have been some cases, if you listen to Jeremy's presentation, there were some cases there where the remedy just nailed it and they got better very quickly. Those cases don't relapse.
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean, but it's like if you haven't been treated in phase 1, the same with my New Yorker friends.
Yeah.
They had minor symptoms, they didn't take it serious, they thought slight cold, whatever, and then they crashed, which is kind of naive when you just left New York and it's our.
Exactly, yes, that's right.
Joe, are you finding any cases where they're having sort of some of these symptoms, but not the chills, not the deep chills? They're just having like, I guess in a lesser, some of the lesser respiratory issues, or some of the SRPs without the chills?
I think one of the difficulties that, and again, without the testing to know, we're probably seeing some cases of just flu that you don't really know if it's this particular epidemic or not, whether it's just a flu. But if they don't have, most of the symptoms of COVID, I would say they're probably just got a cold or flu or something else, more likely. But, people immediately, they get a sore throat and they think, oh my God, I've got it, But it doesn't necessarily mean that. But we don't know. But you would know as it goes on, because that dry cough, I think, is pretty much there in all cases. The chills, not so much, but if there's no fever, and usually fever is accompanied by chills. If there's no fever, I think it's probably not what's going on for that person. You don't get this kind of disturbance without a fever. You know,
Well, the fever, they said it's mild to moderate, so mild fever, people can just say, I'm warm. And
yeah, they might not notice it. If they don't measure their temperature, they might not know they have a fever. That's true.
also, when this all started, we found a remedy called Justicia Iota. I think Sonia got it for all of us. Nobody's talking about that. Its profile really fit in that remedy.
Which remedy is that?
I just put in the chat, Justicia Iota. I mean, its profile really fit in these symptoms.
Justica.
Justica.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, it is a it's an Indian remedy for pneumonias, but I haven't heard any cases that have been treated with it.
It was given out by Farouk Master right early beginning as a possible preventative, as an immune system booster, like the arsenicum.
I see.
Suggested as treatment.
Right. Right. Okay.
So
Yeah,
I used it 2 weeks before I really bad sore throat, dry cough. My wife had it. We use it. It's worked like a magic.
So you used the Justica and you did well.
Yep, my wife did even better than me. And
Oh, that's good information to have. Yeah, I didn't know about this.